Good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you again over Facebook, and I'm again honored to be able to share a few thoughts with you. I hope you all are doing well, that you're healthy, that you're finding that the Lord has some gifts for you in this time of quarantine and with the world being so different, and that in the midst of difficult things that are happening that you're experiencing God's presence. I know for us there have been difficult things and good things as well. I miss you all. I'm excited to get to be together again at some point, hopefully pretty soon. And I hope you all have been enjoying reading Mark. I hope you've taken the chance each day to read it. And we're getting kind of towards the end of Mark, and I wanted to share a few thoughts today about today's reading from chapter 12. So, chapter 12, I think, is really interesting, and everything that happens in this chapter happens because of what happens in chapter 11 when Jesus enters the temple and he drives out the money changers and he turns over the tables and all of that. And that is because in this chapter, people are trying to figure out who Jesus thinks he is. Jesus didn't just go into the temple and get angry and throw a temper tantrum. What Jesus did in the temple, and everyone would have seen it this way, was an act of judgment. He was judging the temple, and what he did by driving out the money changers and everything meant that he stopped the function and work of the temple, even for just a short time. And what he was saying was, this temple isn't doing what God intended it to do. And it's not drawing people into worship. It's not helping people in their relationship with God. And so Jesus does this act of judgment, and Jesus is the one that is going to make the changes. But this upsets the Jewish authorities, right? And so they kind of start coming to Jesus, and they start asking him questions. And they start trying to test him, and they start trying to think of a way to get rid of Jesus because he's threatening their way of life. He's threatening their traditions. He's threatening the things that they stand for. So again, like last time I was able to share, this chapter has so many amazing, so many really wonderful things in it, but there are just a couple of things I really want to highlight in this chapter that I think are particularly interesting. And the first theme I want to talk about that this chapter really brings up is the theme of what really belongs to God. And do people act in accordance with the truth about what belongs to God? And so this chapter starts out with this story about a man planting a vineyard and God sending people to get what belongs to God from the produce of this vineyard. And the people not giving God what belongs to him. And then immediately after this, a couple of groups of people decide to send representatives to Jesus to try to catch him. And again, this theme of what belongs to God comes up. It's this fascinating interaction because they send some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus. Pharisees who are like heroes of the Jews, patriotic, good Jews, and Herodians who are these Jewish people but who are sort of collaborating with the Roman Empire. And they send these two groups to Jesus because they're trying to trap him by asking this question, figuring if Jesus answers one way, the Pharisees will get mad at him and have cause to accuse him and kill him. And if he answers the other way, then the Herodians will have cause to accuse him and try him. And so they come to him and they ask this question about taxes. They bring a coin to Jesus with Caesar on it. And they say, are we allowed to pay taxes? What do you think, Jesus? And Jesus, like he does a lot of the time, asks them a question back and says, whose image and likeness is on the coin? And they say, Caesar's. And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And so many times when I've heard people explain this passage, it's used to explain sort of the separation between church and state, that we give to the government what belongs to the government, to God what belongs to God. But I think there's so much more here And it's interesting. I think the key of this, what Jesus is communicating, is all about his question: whose image and likeness is on this coin? When Jesus says that, it forces the people he's talking to, the good Jews he's talking to, and it invites us to remember Genesis 1. Whose image and likeness do we bear? Whose image and likeness is on us? Well, it's God's, right? So even if Caesar's image is on a coin, God's image is on Caesar. So it's not this clever, evasive answer, but in fact, Jesus is saying, no, everything belongs to God, even Caesar. And that should reframe how everyone thinks about what belongs to God and how we live our lives. And that's why people are so amazed. He answered the question with this really deep truth, but he didn't fall into their trap at all. Later on in the chapter, we have this other scholar approach Jesus, and they talk about the greatest commandment and talk about how it's important to give all of what we are to God. And then the chapter ends with this beautiful picture of this widow. And the widow is willing to give so much of what she has to God because she knows and recognizes what belongs to him. And so I sort of just want to invite us to ask the question. I think each one of us, if we were to be asked, if I were to ask you, no, and I certainly know, and would answer, what belongs to God? Well, everything belongs to God. Everything I have is actually God's. Everything is a gift. But this question, this passage, this chapter, invites us to reflect on that and to think about, well, we say that. We say everything belongs to God. I say my kids belong to God. I say my resources belong to God. Am I living like that? Am I behaving like that? Or are there ways that I treat my resources and the things I have as if they don't belong to God? And that's a challenging question for me, and I think can be a challenging question for us to think about too. The second theme in this chapter that I think is really interesting and really important is the theme of truth. Jesus in this passage says a lot of truth. He says a lot of true things to these groups of Jews, and the thing about the truth he tells them is that those truths are hard truths. He says true things that people don't necessarily want to hear. He tells true things that are going to get him in trouble. He tells true things about who the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders are and the condition of their hearts and what they're doing and how God views it, that is going to make them really angry and upset and only give them more motivation to want to hurt him. But he tells the truth. And in this, I see two things. I see someone who's willing to tell the truth, even when it's hard, and I see people who are unwilling to hear truth when it's hard. And for me, that raises two questions. To what extent in my life am I a truth teller? Am I willing to tell hard truths, even when that will make me unliked? And a lot of the times, I have to be honest, it's really hard for me to say those things. Really, really hard, because I don't want to make enemies. I want people to like me. And the other question is, am I willing to hear hard truth from people about me, about my life? Do I have people in my life who are willing to tell me those kinds of things? Or do I surround myself with people who will tell me what I want to hear? Are we the kinds of people who are willing to hear hard truth from God, from Jesus, but from other people around us who can sometimes speak on Jesus' behalf? So those are the reflections I want to leave you with tonight about living our lives, recognizing the truth of what belongs to God and what doesn't, and also about truth. And are we people of truth? Are we people who speak truth, who receive truth, who live by the truth, even when those truths are hard? I hope that reflecting on this chapter was fruitful for you, is fruitful for you. I hope that there's something that you can take home a little bit and think about more. And I'm excited to continue to see what God does in each of our lives as we have the kind of time and opportunity to be together in this way and to read God's word together. Have a great weekend, everyone.